Listen, ever since they robbed Austin Butler of his Elvis Oscar, I am henceforth obliged to watch anything he's in, as long as it's not propaganda, of course.
I'm glad we're not watching a cop show. Gotta stop mythologizing the police, for Christ's sake. Come on.
I depend on your poor judgment.
I want to know if I can take this seriously.
What do you need to take us seriously?
Lord have mercy.
Hi, I'm LadyJenevia, and on my channel I talk about entertainment media. This is going to be yet another video in my ongoing series where I read the source material of an upcoming film adaptation, I tell you what's in that source material, and since there is already a trailer out, I'm going to also share some thoughts about the adaptation process and what might be in the film. Today we're going to be talking about Caught Stealing, which is a book by Charlie Huston, who is also doing the screenplay for the film adaptation, which will be directed by Darren Aronofsky. The first thing I want to say is that in reading this book, this really doesn't seem like the type of story that I would expect Darren Aronofsky to direct. This feels like a real throwback to that sort of 90s or maybe even 80s movie where there's some sort of crime and then the movie feels like we are running until we hit the credits. Now, that doesn't mean that the pace is exhausting. There are peaks and valleys in those types of films, but think about something like Colin Farrell in Phone Booth or Harrison Ford in The Fugitive, and that's really the vibe that I'm thinking of. The trailer, however, seems to have a bit more levity and fun infused. The tone has been lifted, probably because the mainstream audience is already feeling down, so you're going to more likely have a wider commercial appeal if you're offering a bit of fun with your action thriller. Now, admittedly, that might just be a marketing choice where they cut the trailer to seem more fun than it actually is, but then the film itself is going to have dirt under its fingernails the way that the book does, but I can already tell that they're making quite a few changes with the book in the adaptation process. Before we go through things sequentially, in just looking at the trailer, we can see Vincent D'Onofrio and Liev Schreiber playing some sort of group that, based on their attire, as well as the scene with Carol Kane, does not match anything that I read in the book. Also, on a more superficial level, Regina King's character in the book is actually a man, and in general, when I skimmed through the list of which character names have been published thus far, only a few of the top-billed characters match the names of the characters in the book. So all that to say, I would imagine that they're taking a similar foundation from what's in the book and the very broad premise, and then they're just doing something different with the mayhem that Austin Butler's character Hank gets into. The specific logistics of the miscellaneous characters he encounters and the various obstacles can be altered so that the end result is largely the same with the conflict and strife for the story's protagonist. But now let's go through some of the main beats of the book story, so I will issue a full spoiler alert for the book and perhaps a spoiler alert for the film, which I have not seen yet. Although it seems like they will be doing their own thing with the film, there may very well be enough overlap that some plot points might be spoiled for the film adaptation as I explain what's in the book. The book is divided into 4 parts, plus a brief epilogue. Each of these sections lists a date of when it takes place and a countdown of sorts to do with baseball. Now, I don't follow sports, especially baseball, so a lot of the references to do with that I'm going to just skip over because if it's supposed to be serving some sort of subtextual purpose in the story, I wouldn't be the person to explain that to you. Part 1 is called 8 Regular Season Games Remaining, and it takes place from September 22nd to 28th in the year 2000. Apart from a bit of backstory for our protagonist Hank, the entire story in the book takes place in the year 2000. Great year, by the way. That's when Charlie's Angels was released.
I was wondering if...
No.
So you're saying
No.
there's no chance
No.
First things first, let's meet our protagonist Hank, whose real name is Henry Thompson. He now lives in New York City, but he's originally from Oakland, or at least I think he's supposed to be from Oakland. They mention him being an only child from a pleasant suburb a ways east of San Francisco, which sounds like a really weird way to say Oakland for people who have never looked at a map of California before. Also, I am pretty sure they mention Oakland at other points throughout the book, so I don't know why they do such a weird roundabout description of it at the very beginning of the story, but there you have it. Hank had a nice childhood with loving parents. He was a highly gifted baseball player on track to become a professional, but then he suffered a bad leg injury during a high school game, and that's that. No more path to becoming a professional baseball player. Now, with all of that emotional and psychological trauma from the injury, as well as the loss of his dream, he begins to get into trouble. He dabbles in some juvenile delinquent behavior, breaks into some houses, though they don't tell you that detail of his backstory until later, but I'm just telling you now for the sake of organization. And then Hank got into a car accident with his friend Rich. Rich wasn't wearing a seatbelt, so he died. Hank obviously survived, but he's got even more trauma from that, and you hear him say throughout the story that he doesn't drive, and various criminals will say things to him like, well, what do you mean you don't know how to drive? You're from California. And Hank goes, I didn't say I don't know how to drive. I know how to drive. I just don't drive. And the subtext of this is that he doesn't want to get behind the wheel of a car again because it reminds him of the death of his friend Rich. So if they do something similar in the film, if and when he finally does drive, that will be a big emotional moment where he is working to overcome that block he has within himself and address things that he's not been addressing. He attends university in Northern California for 6 years and studies a bit of everything and does fine academically, but he never graduates. He just seems lost because of everything he's been through. So he meets a girl who is an actress and he moves with her to New York City. They initially are staying on her friend's couch, but that only lasts for 2 weeks because then the girl gets a job on the road and she takes off and Hank has to move out. After that, he gets a small apartment, he gets a job as a bartender, and he's overall a pretty nice guy to coworkers, vagrants on the street, and the people in his building, until one day, mayhem comes crashing into his life. Now, in the present day, Hank finds himself down a kidney because he was badly assaulted by 2 bad guys at the bar he works at. The bad guys had these Eastern European accents and were wearing tracksuits. Now, initially, you as the reader think that this is just a really unfortunate occurrence, but in actuality, Hank and the readers eventually learn that those 2 bad guys are in fact part of a bigger scheme that is already in motion that Hank unexpectedly finds himself pulled into. So Hank has an appointment to see Dr. Bob, a good-hearted man who works to serve patients who are actually in need, people who are low income, without health insurance, and so on and so forth. Hank had a problem with his feet aching, much of which came from having a job that had him standing on his feet for long hours. But Hank has an accident at his appointment with Dr. Bob, and there is blood in his accident, and then he wakes up in the emergency room. So he spent 1 day there unconscious, and then 5 days conscious after that, and his kidney was removed because it was nearly ruptured by the assault, and also that situation was worsened by his overconsumption of alcohol. From there, he's advised to never drink alcohol again, don't smoke, and don't consume caffeine. He already doesn't smoke or consume caffeine, but he does have a bit of a drinking habit, so throughout the book, Hank struggles to not drink, especially in high-stress situations. I wouldn't necessarily say that he's an alcoholic, but he is prone to indulging in it both for fun, as well as having a lot of trauma from the loss of his baseball dreams, the car accident that killed his friend Rich, and a lot more trauma that gets added to him over the course of the violent events of the book. Dr. Bob tells Hank that his foot problem is chronic and that the only way to make the pain go away is to get off his feet. The problem was also exacerbated by poor circulation related to excessive alcohol consumption. So that is twice the reason for him to need to stop drinking alcohol. Hank calls his parents to check in on them. Like I said before, they are loving parents, but there is this undercurrent of sadness in the way he talks to them, as if he feels like he's a disappointment to them, although they are never conveying that message to him. Hank also has a bit of a situationship with a woman named Yvonne, who is also a bartender from work.
Last call. Drink 'em if you got 'em.
Let's go back to your place and you can take advantage of my poor judgment.
I depend on your poor judgment.
She is played by Zoë Kravitz in the film, and I'm jumping ahead slightly to tell you this, but she gets fridged in the book fairly early on, and I'm not sure if they would be inclined to do the exact same thing in the film adaptation. If they wanted to go for a more commercial appeal, they would probably just have her survive, so that in the end, she and Hank can ride off into the sunset together. Darren Aronofsky's work, though, is twisted and morbid and disturbing enough for me to think that, yes, she might still die in the film. But again, this book and the way the trailer presents the film adaptation, it really doesn't feel like an Aronofsky story. So I'm equally confused and intrigued at this being the story that he would take on next. But anyway, we will get back to Yvonne in a moment. Hank has been looking after a cat belonging to his neighbor from across the hall, who is a man named Russ. Russ is played by Matt Smith in the film, although in the book, the character is not British. Oh.
Oi! What the fuck you doing, geezer?
Is that the best you can do? I've got to fly back to London. I need you to take care of my cat.
I like cats.
The trailer has Russ saying he needs to go back to London for a bit, which is why he needs Hank to look after the cat. But in the book, Russ is going to visit his sick father elsewhere in New York. I believe they mention it being in Rochester, but those details aren't that important for you to know. So Hank agrees to look after the cat for a couple of days or a week or two at most. There is an automatic feeder, so it's able to stay fed while Hank was unexpectedly stuck in the hospital. The cat's name is Bud, and I'm going to tell you right now before it comes up. Bud is the #1 reason why I will not recommend reading this book to anyone. Bud experiences a completely unnecessary violent attack by one of the bad guys in the book, and I will not describe it to you in detail at any point in this video. If you are a sicko who wants to know the specifics, you can go ahead and go to your local library and get the book to read for yourself. But I will tell you right now that I'm going to assume they won't do that in the film. #1, it's not a commercially appealing thing to subject a mainstream audience to. And #2, when they show Hank in the movie trailer bringing the cat to Yvonne, the cat is conscious and not visibly injured or bleeding, so that's already different from the book. We will get to that though, bear with. So Hank comes home and finds that the cat is fine, and Hank begins to dump his large supply of alcohol down the toilet. He cleans the litter box, and he proceeds to take out the trash. The book also introduces us to Tim, a functioning alcoholic who was only able to become functional by becoming, I think it's called a runner or whatever you call a delivery man for illicit substances. So Tim becomes functionally important to the story much later on. So just remember that Tim exists and he has connections to people who do illegal things. Hank wants to do some laundry and decides that he will also wash Bud's blanket. But while he's ruffling around in the cat box that Bud sleeps in, he finds a flat object taped to the bottom, and upon further inspection, he learns that it's a manila envelope with a key inside. And that key is about to completely blow up Hank's life. So Hank goes down to the laundromat to do his laundry, and when he's coming back, he passes by the pizza place, which is next door to his apartment building, and inside of that, he thinks he sees the 2 men that had beat him up and made him lose one of his kidneys. So then he hurriedly goes inside, he goes up to his floor, and he hears some men, different from the ones who beat him up, and those men are outside his door, and he hears what he assumes to be them breaking into his apartment. So Hank goes up to the roof, which he has access to because he previously helped the building super with some renovations. Hank looks down below and sees that the men who beat him up have moved across the street to stand in front of the tattoo parlor shop, and they are very unsubtly scoping out Hank's apartment building. So Hank goes and uses the fire escape to sneak back into his apartment and hears that the men who he thought was breaking into his apartment are actually in Russ's apartment, and they leave after 15 minutes. Hank then calls the police, and Detective Lieutenant Roman of robbery/homicide shows up. Now in the book, this is a man, but in the film, Roman is played by Regina King. Roman is a major villain of the story, but I think the idea of him being played by Regina King instead opens up a whole new set of opportunities. You could maybe make the character come across as more sympathetic, which is understandable because the audience, we love Regina King. Or you could play with the audience's perception, where you can really play around with the mystery of whether or not Roman is as bad as we think she is. Can she really be trusted? And an unassuming audience might really stay in that mystery for a while longer because we love Regina King and it's very easy for us to like her. So Hank tells Roman about being beat up by 2 Eastern Europeans who were watching his building, that some other men were in Russ's apartment. Russ's real name is Mr. Miner, by the way, M-I-N-E-R. Hank describes the 3 men he got a glimpse of that were looking around in Russ's apartment. Roman asks if Russ was involved in anything illegal, and Hank says that he doesn't know anything about what Russ was up to. And it's not until Roman leaves that he remembers the key in the manila envelope, and he briefly considers maybe he should have let Roman know about that. Hank then has a nightmare where his life is going the way he wishes it had, where he's now a professional baseball player. He catches a ball during a game that secures the team the win, and then his friend Rich comes to visit. But then, after they've talked for a bit, Hank remembers what really happened and that Rich is actually dead, and he wakes up screaming. It's 2 a.m. and someone is knocking on Russ's door, so Hank grabs an aluminum bat for protection. He looks out the peephole and he sees 2 different men. The smaller of the two is wearing a lot of silver rings, and he writes a note which they leave for Russ. After they leave, Hank checks the note, and it reads, "Russ just stopped by to say hello. Deeply concerned. Please call. Ed and Paris." Now, all of this stress is too much for Hank to bear, so he goes to the bar, called Paul's, where he's worked before all of this happened, and he gets very drunk, directly disregarding medical advice. Yvonne tries to help him home, but he brushes off that help, so the next morning, Hank wakes up at his apartment to the sound of Bud meowing. "You need to refill his feeder, you pinhead." Also, Hank has had an accident, front and back.
That's gross.
So he showers and gathers up his soiled clothing and bed items and goes out to throw them away. But when he comes back, he spots the men who beat him up outside of his building, so he takes the same route as before, where he goes up to the roof with the intention of using the fire escape to get to a payphone to call the police, but he can't because someone grabs him by the ankles and drags him back downstairs to his apartment, where Detective Lieutenant Roman is with the criminal henchman, including the one who dragged him back down from the roof. And basically, it's the first group of men that he saw breaking into Russ's apartment. So Bud has already been injured at this point, and even though these criminals also violently assault Hank to interrogate information out of him, or try to anyway, one of them also does further redacted animal cruelty to Bud that made me so enraged that I threw the book to the bottom of my list of 2025 books that I've read for YouTube. That will be its own video, by the way. Subscribe and stick around through December, and you'll be able to know that full list. If that wasn't enough, I also don't like the book because of its writing style. The style in question is non-existent. Also, they don't use quotation marks for the majority of dialogue. Is this a published novel or a first-time publishing on AO3 fanfiction? And that's nothing negative to AO3. There are truly phenomenal writers on that site who are well aware of how to use quotation marks. But just get a look at this. Anyway, Roman is the leader of these henchmen, and they're all interrogating him about the two men that had come by last night, Ed and Paris. They want to know where Russ is. Hank doesn't know anything, for that matter, so Hank tells them about the key in the cat's carry box, but when they go to look for it, the key's not there. So that's what kicks off the more violent interrogation and the redacted animal cruelty. I'm fast forwarding through a lot of what happens in this scene, but the main points you need to know for the larger story, besides Bud's and Hank's injuries, are that Hank sends them to go to his laundry, which he left up on the roof from the first time he went to hide up there, but he tricks them into setting off the fire alarm for the building. Roman and the henchmen have to leave because of the fire alarm, but all of this is far from over. Hank patches himself up just a bit. He grabs a ticket he had already pre-bought to go back home to see his parents for the holidays, but apparently he can use it early. I don't know how American public transportation worked in the year 2000. Hank packs up Bud as well, and they get a taxi to Yvonne's place, where she is shocked to see him in such a bad state. Hank tells her that someone hurt his cat, and then he blacks out. And that is the end of part 1. I'm glad that he's at least now claiming the cat as his own, and I'm glad that the movie trailer shows the cat seemingly uninjured, because you can just violently interrogate Hank to try to get answers without going anywhere near the cat. And if you brutalize Bud the way he is in the book, I swear to you now, Darren Aronofsky, that I will rate your film half a star on Letterboxd and probably seriously consider boycotting the rest of your films. I've completely sworn off a different director, whom I will not name, because everyone was hyping this director up, and I put one of their films on because I was curious, and there was real animal cruelty towards a cat in the film. None of the film bros ever warned me about that one, and I've not gone near that filmmaker ever since.
Take it away before I gag.
Part 2 of this book is called 3 Regular Season Games Remaining, and it takes place on September 29th. When Henry wakes up, Yvonne says she has to go to work, but she has left him a note, which says that he should have some water and rest up. When he wakes up again, he finds that Bud has had his injuries patched up. He now has a little leg cast on, as well as some cat painkillers. Also, I didn't mention this before, but Hank has some Vicodin he was given because of his kidney removal, and initially he doesn't want to take them because of how strong they are, but he gradually takes more of them throughout the book, the more injuries he begins to accumulate. At first, he takes none, and then he takes half of one, and eventually he takes a full dose, which was, I think, 2. I don't remember. It doesn't matter. Yvonne tries to get Hank to call 911, but he is able to talk her out of that idea. He does, however, call Dr. Bob to come by and tend to his new wounds. She never finds out the full extent of what's going on, but the film seems to hint that this version of Yvonne does know some or all of what's going on with Hank, so I suppose he's going to tell her in the film, but I don't really see her partaking in all of the running around that he gets into after he leaves her place, so that does still leave things open to the possibility of her character being fridged the way that she was in the book. Personally, I'm hoping that she will just go off and hide somewhere with Bud so that Bud can stay out of harm's way until all of the violence and mayhem wraps up. Hank heads out with the intention of getting the key and turning it over to Roman, but when he leaves the apartment building, he is kidnapped by the two men he saw outside Russ's door and leaving the note for him. Their names are Ed and Paris, and they are brothers. One other thing I want to mention, without details though, this book has a lot of slurs in it that are completely unnecessary to the plot. I don't know what you're trying to prove. Is it, oh, well, Hank's the good guy and deserves to make it out of all of this alive because a whole array of evil criminals and randomly aggressive strangers he encounters keep using slurs. But I kept pausing my reading to go do literally anything else because it was the most unpleasant read thus far of my 2025 reading for YouTube list. So anyway, Ed and Paris further rough up Hank to try to question him about the other criminals Hank has encountered thus far, Roman and his various henchmen, and Hank tells them everything that's happened thus far about the key, but he doesn't have the key with him, so no matter how much they demand it with violence, that's not going to get the key to magically appear. At some point, Hank has the thought to himself that if drunk him were to want to hide the key somewhere and he deemed it important, he would have had it be put into the vault that is at the bar he used to work at. So Ed and Paris take a different approach and they tell Hank that Russ had a very simple job, which was to meet them somewhere with something important, but Russ messed around and now everyone is looking for him. Then they tell him some of their traumatic childhood backstory, which I don't think is that important for you to know because the only characters they seem to be keeping the same names for in the film adaptation are Hank, Roman, Yvonne, and Russ. And all the stuff we're now getting into, I'm assuming is going to have very different plot events with different gangster criminal characters. So we'll just fast forward to the main point, which is that Ed and Paris demand the key, and for Hank to help them set up Roman and the rest of his crew, whom they intend to kill. And then, in exchange, no one will ever bother Hank again. Hank agrees just to be able to get the hell out of their car, after which Hank calls his mother once again to check in. Hank weighs his options and decides that Ed and Paris are just too erratic to trust, so he decides to go with Roman, who seems to be the more calm, cool, and collected and trustworthy option.
But I knew who they were, and I told her who they were. Shitheads.
He's not really, but Hank doesn't know that. So he calls Roman and decides to make a deal. And then Hank stops by the bar, the regular bar he always goes to, and pops out briefly to get some things to patch up his kidney surgery wound since the staples aren't doing particularly well at the moment. So he buys some things and he sneaks out the back when he sees one of Roman's henchmen named Red, because of his dyed hair, who ends up chasing after Hank. Hank takes off running and he tosses the shopping bag aside so he can run faster. He goes into a cinema to hide, but Red catches up with him there in the bathroom. There is more fighting, during which Red says to him, "F Roman, I want the key," meaning that Red wants the key for himself. But Hank manages to get away. He finds the discarded shopping bag. He heads back to the bar, drops off some things he had bought for a few friends that he knows there. He then goes back to Yvonne's place and discovers her body because she has been violently fridged. I will spare you the details, except for the fact that she has some marks on her neck. Just remember that detail because we will come back to it. Hank goes into shock and curls up underneath the table her body is on, and Bud comes and curls up with him because cats are better than people. A neighbor of Yvonne's had called the police, so Hank is brought in. He's being questioned by some police, and then guess who comes in? Roman, of course. So the original cops leave, and Roman turns off the various surveillance equipment, and he rearranges the pictures of the crime scene, and he tells Hank that he was not the one to do this. Roman gets Hank out of the police station, and with Bud, very important to know. I just want to remind everyone that from this point out, there is no other horrific stuff that happens to Bud, so just rest easy if I mention his name. I still think it's a far too stressful series of events for him to be caught up in when he is a domestic house cat, and he should just be at home somewhere, lounging and napping and snacking. But nothing like what happened in the earlier scene that was super horrible is going to happen again. While in the car, Roman shows Hank a picture of Yvonne. It's a close-up of her neck, and he points out the distinct bruising and explains that these bruises are caused when someone wears brass knuckles or several rings. Remember from before how Hank spied on Ed in Paris when they were leaving a note for Russ? He had noticed that these men were wearing too many rings on their hands. Too many rings, what would I know about that?
Ferre, Armani, and Versace.
Roman still wants the key, and the henchmen get in the car with them. We've got Bolo, Red, the Russians. I don't know what sort of clown car this is for all these people to fit inside of it, but that's really not the point. Red keeps saying rude things into Hank's ear, so Hank snaps and he tells Roman about his earlier encounter with Red, where Hank won the fight, and Red was trying to get the key for himself and had even said F Roman. So what does Roman do? He shoots Red dead there in the car, creating quite the mess for everyone to have to clean up. If they do anything like this in the film, I really hope they keep the part where Hank responds to all of this by screaming like a girl, because it would be a very funny throwback for Austin Butler specifically. So this mess is being cleaned up, and Hank says he'll go get the key, and he heads to Paul's, the bar. But when he asks Edwin about getting into the safe, Edwin is, I think, the manager. Anyway, he tells Hank he never gave him a key or an envelope, and then Hank starts to panic. Then henchmen come in, they start shooting up the place, killing everyone there, and it's quite sad for Hank because there were loads of regulars in there whom he had become friendly with over the years of him living in New York City and working at that specific bar. That is the short version, because action isn't really as interesting to just quickly retell in a video like this, but if they were to do this section on screen and do it well, it could be something fun to watch, especially since they seem to possibly be going for more of a comedic tone, which is nice since I'm not really in the mood for overly heavy, depressing art right now. Maybe you are, and if that's the case, that's all right. But a one-to-one adaptation of this book to screen, that's not something I'm all that interested in. Some of the bad guys also got shot up in the process of attacking the bar. Hank gets away from the bar without being caught by police and heads back to his own apartment, and he has a thought. Remember how he had his front and back accident because he was drunk and he threw away his soiled clothing? Well, he goes and finds the garbage bag he threw out, and his soiled clothing is still in there, and guess what's in the pocket of his soiled trousers? The key. So now it's time to head back to his apartment, and guess who's returned from his trip and comes barging in? Russ.
What the fuck did you get me into?
Now, unfortunately for Russ, Hank had grabbed the bat when he heard someone coming into the apartment, and he hit him. And then he grabbed a cup of water and splashed him awake, and then he knocked him unconscious again when he asked for his cat back. And that's the end of part 2.
What the fuck did you get me into?
Darling, you got to let me know.
Welcome to Narnia.
Part 3 is called 2 Regular Season Games Remaining, and it also takes place on September 29th. Can you believe that? All of the mayhem that just happened? One single day.
Oh my God, this is crazy.
Hank and Russ hide in Russ's apartment while the cops show up and search Hank's apartment. After that, Hank begins to shave his head into a buzz cut and get rid of his stubble in order to try to be less recognizable compared to his mugshot. He tells Russ about everything that's been going on while he was away, so Russ proceeds to pull a Chrome 22 on him. So Hank says the key is in his jacket pocket on the couch, and when Russ looks in that direction, Hank knocks the gun out of his hand and knees Russ in the crotch. Russ definitely has a concussion, by the way, so getting him to stay focused remains difficult through basically all of what's left for him in this story. They catch a cab and head to Russ's storage unit in Chelsea, and when they get in there, we learn that the thing that everyone is after is a bag stuffed with a massive amount of cash.
Welcome to Narnia.
Should I stay or should I go?
How much is there?
Over 4 million.
Shit.
Hank and Russ begin to count the money while Russ tells Hank the entire backstory of him meeting Ed in Paris at a youth camp they were all sent to because they were all youth who got into trouble. They stayed friends even afterwards and reunited as adults. Ed and Paris had criminal ambitions, and Russ joined in, but once Russ got interested in acting and Ed and Paris's crimes were escalating, Russ didn't really want to be involved as much, so he set Ed and Paris up with the other henchmen we have already met in the story who are now working for Roman. Roman comes into this backstory because he was a cop with a gambling problem, and still is, and one day the criminal group robbed a shady card game that they didn't realize was one that cops were playing at. Roman had tracked down Ed and Paris because he had caught on to their various jobs a while ago, and he himself is in a lot of debt. So he basically announces that he wants to be their criminal manager because he recognizes their talent. So once in a while, Roman will set up a big job, and then afterwards he uses his law enforcement status and connections to get the attention off of the real perpetrators of that job. So it's all going well for a while. Roman often invests his money in Atlantic City stocks and bonds. Also, he's a big gambler. The big guy who did Redacted Animal Cruelty and Red just party their way through their money. And Ed and Paris stockpile most of the cash they have accumulated. Now, one day a job goes wrong, so Ed and Paris call up Russ and say that they want to retire, but they don't quite have enough cash yet, so they want to do a final series of jobs, cash everything in, and head down to Mexico or wherever. Now, apparently bank cash is dirty and needs to be cleaned. I don't know about any of this, money laundering or whatever, but they can't do that money laundering on their own, so they have to get the Russian mafia involved, courtesy of Roman, who has those connections to them, to help get this money cleaned. Those were the two men who had beat Hank out of one of his kidneys. Ed and Paris sent a large cash supply of that bank money to Russ, and that large of an amount of money makes people foolish. So here we are. In total, the cash is about $4.5 million. They pack everything up in a bag and they head out. Hank calls his parents again to check in, and apparently the police have called his parents to look for Hank. Hank assures his parents that he didn't do what he was accused of, and he tells them that he loves them. Hank does a not great job at stitching up Russ's head wound, and then he calls Roman, saying that he wants to make a deal. Hank wants to be able to get out of all of this without being blamed for these crimes. Roman says that he can make that happen, but in order to do that, they will need a fall guy. So Hank decides that he can give Russ to Roman to be that guy. Roman will get the money, and Hank will get the cat back and be able to get on with his life. Hank refuses to bring the cash, but he says that he will give him the key as well as Russ. So the deal is struck. Hank and Russ steal a car, and they drive to the meet. Hank assures Russ that he will get out of this alive, and it will be fine. But Russ doesn't think so. They go, and they start to make their exchanges. Hank gives Roman a key to a uni at Manhattan Mini Storage. Now, for anyone who doesn't remember, Russ's storage is in Chelsea, so Hank's actually given Roman his own key to his own storage unit. He's pulling a switcheroo, or whatever you call it.
The deception! The betrayal!
Hank successfully gets Bud back in his cat carrier, and during this switch, henchman Bolo accidentally elbows Roman on the back of his neck and knocks him down, and in that process, a pair of brass knuckles are knocked out of Roman's pocket. And that's when Hank remembers what Roman said about the bruising on Yvonne's neck, and how one of the ways that that specific type of bruising forms is from someone wearing brass knuckles. So Hank is more assured than ever that Roman is bad news. Now, Hank had also left a gun hidden in the car for Russ to use, which he does on one of the henchmen, from whom he steals a machine gun, and proceeds to let that rip, prompting the bad guys to drop for cover, and Hank takes off running with Bud back towards the getaway car, and they do in fact make their getaway. But of course, Roman and company take off, high-speed pursuit, and all of that makes it down into the New York subway, where they are eventually able to get away from Roman and company. But unfortunately, Russ succumbs to his wounds, and Hank leaves his body there on the train. I'm fast-forwarding through quite a few of these details, but anyway, that's the end of part 3.
Should I stay or should I go?
How much is there? Over 4 million. Shit.
Part 4 is called Final Day of the Regular Season and takes place on September 30th. Let's have another quick call to Hank's parents to say that you love them and tell them goodbye. Then Hank calls up Ed in Paris, feeling like this is now his best option. It's going to take them a while to reach him, so he needs to wait and stay hidden in the city until tomorrow evening, so Hank decides to sleep on some cardboard outside with the bag of cash and Bud's bag. He lets Bud out a bit to come cuddle with him, and at one point Bud makes a pained sound, so Hank gives him some of his cat painkillers he was given from his earlier emergency vet appointment that Yvonne had taken him to. Early in the morning, Hank goes to buy some cans of cat food, some batteries, a bit of food for himself, and water. He also decides to get a Metro card, bought with cash, and goes to Coney Island with Bud just to pass the time. He and Bud eat their food, they reach Coney Island, and hit some baseballs for the first time since his career-ending accident. While doing this, he reflects on everything that's gone wrong in his life, how he is tired of being everyone's patsy in this wild situation he now finds himself in, and when he checks the time and finds that it's 11 a.m., he realizes he has a friend back in town that he needs to see. So he goes back into the city and finesses his way into a specific building and barges into Tim's apartment. Does everyone remember Tim? He is the functioning alcoholic who became a delivery man of illicit substances, and thus he is connected with people who do illegal things. Now, Tim is terrified at first because he thinks that Hank did all of these murders he's being accused of, but with enough begging and insisting that he didn't do it, Hank is able to get him back on his side and agrees to hook him up with the people he needs to meet. Hank doesn't have all of the cash on him at that moment, but he does have enough to be able to buy his way into being specially driven to a meeting with a man named Billy, whom Hank pays to make new fake IDs, a passport, social security card, and he's even able to digitally alter his appearance and remove the bruises, which what kind of supercomputer do you have in your lair in the year 2000 that is allowing you to do all of that while making fake IDs? But he gives him the documents he'll need and also a credit card he can use to buy the ticket at the airport to leave, because apparently folks will be on the lookout for people buying last-minute tickets with cash, but he is instructed that he needs to get rid of the credit card immediately after getting the tickets. Hank's fake new name is John Peter Carlisle, and Billy further coaches him into doing things like practicing signing his signature of his new name, how to talk to any strangers that will try to start conversations, but in a way without being suspicious. And he also advises Hank to get rid of the cat because this is a distinct identifier. But Hank refuses, and that's how I knew this is my guy. Never let anyone talk you out of protecting your cat. Hank/John gets back on the train with Bud in tow and all of these new documents, and Hank yells at some man that won't stop looking at him on the train, and that successfully makes everyone on the train not want to look at him. And I suppose that's that New York train energy.
Back the fuck up! Get away from me, all of you!
Hank makes it to his meeting with Ed and Paris, who are surprised by how rough Hank looks from everything he's been through, but also how he seems more focused now and determined. His vibe is different. They go back to the storage unit in Chelsea where they have to threaten the security guard into being let in, and they begin to pack up the cash and head to the apartment that Ed and Paris grew up in. They ask who killed Russ, and Hank admits that it was him. Ed and Paris are not too upset because Russ was the one who screwed them over in the first place and jump-started this whole mess that they're now in. The next part of the plan is for Hank to call Roman, and Ed tells him exactly what to say. Hank offers to give him the $4 million in exchange for helping Hank to get out of town and no longer be pursued by the Russian mafia. The meet place Roman and henchman Bolo are supposed to come to is Astor Place and stand out on the traffic island with the big cube. At that point, Hank will show up when he feels that it's safe, hand Roman a big bag of money, and trust Roman not to shoot him while they're surrounded by witnesses. Hank also says that if the Russians come after Hank, he will lie and say that it was Roman who killed one of their boys. Good, meeting set for 10 o'clock. Ed and Paris set Hank up with a .32 Colt Detective Special, no safety, minimum recoil, designed for concealment, and very short-range combat. Also, it's loaded. This is when they reveal that Hank used to go shooting with friends and he never let his mother know, so he does in fact know how to handle a weapon. The actual plan is for them to wait for Roman and Bolo to stand at this meeting spot, and Ed and Paris will do a drive-by and dispense of them. However, the Bolo that is standing there at the meet is a fake Bolo in a wig that goes flying off, and when Hank tries to get up from his seat in the nearby coffee shop where he was watching for them to arrive, the real Bolo pops up and snatches Hank. Roman had correctly guessed that Hank got back involved with Ed in Paris, so he wants Hank to go call them with a fake call. But on the way to the phone, in the middle of this crowded cafe, Hank yells out, "I am Henry Thompson. I am wanted for multiple homicide." And that sends everyone screaming, running, and panicking. And in all of that commotion, Hank swings a table at Bolo, and the table leg hits Bolo in the temple. But the commotion attracts Roman and the Russian mafia guy who was dressed in a bad wig pretending to be Bolo. So this mafia guy is now trying to hold Hank at gunpoint, but Roman comes out of a subway station entrance with a gun in each hand, and he proceeds to shoot the fake Bolo dead. Hank takes off running, and he hides behind a pillar at St. Mark's Church, and he's crouching down, but Roman appears and holds Hank at gunpoint. Also, it's raining at the moment. I love that for the drama. It's very step up to the streets. But Hank has his own gun hidden, so he's able to pop Roman in the leg, and then he keeps popping until Roman's gone. Now, there is a villain monologue in here, but at this point, who cares? I just want Bud to get his happy ending, because what? Cats are better than people. Hank goes and meets Ed and Paris, and guess who's in the backseat of the car? Bud. Safe, fluffy, no new injuries. They drive off together, and once they are out of the commotion, there's a bit of a tense standoff in the car where Ed and Paris are talking about how there's actually no honor among thieves, and that Russ betraying them really hurt because they had been friends for all of those years. But through all of this, their instincts are now telling them that Hank is trustworthy, so they give him an offer. They're willing to let Hank out of the car with a couple $100,000, and he can try to start over, or whatever else that it is that he wants to do. And Hank, who has been secretly holding on to his own gun for this entire tense conversation, he agrees to this deal. The tension of that moment is broken. All's well that ends well. Except for the fact that one of the brothers, I don't know which one it was because of that horrible writing style without quotation marks or effective explanations about who's talking at that moment, proceeds to admit to Hank that they were in fact the ones to kill Yvonne. So Hank realizes those marks on her neck were in fact from their many rings, and Hank, being the fully indoctrinated cat dad that he is, gets Bud out of the way and ducks down and shoots both of the brothers dead. So Hank gets the best boy in the world, Bud. He grabs all of the cash, puts it in a bag, and heads off. After walking back into the city with his chronic foot pain, he uses some cash to buy a few things from a homeless man in order to become more inconspicuous: a coat, a shopping cart. He finds a warm grate to settle down on for the night with Bud. Hank then buys a few things the next morning that he will need for the next bit of his journey, such as new clothes, and hires the same town car that drove him to get his new IDs. And then he heads to the airport. He successfully uses the credit card that was given to him to buy a first-class ticket to Cancun, and he uses the cover story he was given to use whenever people are taken aback by how much more visibly injured he is now than he is in his ID photo, which is to say that he was in a car accident. The giant cash stash is in his checked suitcase, but he doesn't have the necessary paperwork to bring a cat on board, so he uses the cat painkillers to mellow Bud out, and then he uses the spare bandages to make a sling to cradle Bud against his body and put his clothes on over him so that little Bud just looks like a beer belly. And because this is the year 2000, that actually works with airport security. And in first class, Hank is given a hot towel, which he puts over his face to hide his tears. Now listen, I think they will give him a happier ending in the film adaptation. It's just giving more commercial vibes to me currently, but if they need Austin Butler to cry, I can guarantee you he will cry like his life depends on it, and it will be cinema. Hank and Bud make it to Cancun. He picks up the cash stash luggage, gets through customs without triggering the random search, and that is the end of part 4. Now, the epilogue is quite short. It's called Single Game Playoff and takes place on October 1st. And I do wish that they had given it a date of at least a week or a month onward to give him time to get settled in. I mean, let me ask the audience, do you feel rested the day after an international flight? Because I know I don't. And I'm not the one that went through a novel's worth of violent thriller mayhem with a whole array of gangsters and a corrupt cop ringleader. Hank got himself a room on the beach, but he is visiting a bar at the moment, and he brought Bud with him. Luckily, the bartenders and random pretty girls who are there all think that Bud is cute and great and nothing happens to him. Hank enjoys some peanuts that are dusted in chili powder. He's also enjoying a Jarritos orange soda and watches a baseball game on television. His feet don't hurt at all, which is again proof to me that there should be more of a time jump for this epilogue, because if I've been running through New York City for my life, my feet will ache the next day. And I don't have chronic pain the way that Hank does. We know he does because he was diagnosed with it at the beginning of the book. Also, he decides to order a beer. I hate that detail as well. He was repeatedly told that it's a matter of life and death to stop drinking, and he justified the odds and managed to survive and start a new life in Cancun. No drinking. If you ruin your one remaining kidney, who is going to take care of Bud? So overall, I give this book a score of there isn't a single regular viewer of mine that I would recommend to read this, especially when there are so many other better books that you can read. As for a film adaptation, I'm cautiously optimistic about that. Maybe it won't be as light and comedic as the trailer is suggesting, but I still think that they won't make it have as dark-sided of an energy as the book has. Initially, I just saw new Austin Butler movie and I was on board because he was robbed of his Elvis Oscar, and you will never convince me otherwise of that. But then I go and read the book and I don't like it, but I do find out in this research process that Regina King is going to play Roman. And to that I say, oh, I'm ready to have some fun.